Hey guys, this is Vamsi from Futurely. Today, we're going to learn how we can use ZBrush to create architectural compositions. So if you know briefly about ZBrush, it's a modeling platform that's widely used in gaming, animation, and VFX industry. So how can we as architects utilize ZBrush to create intriguing architectural compositions? That's precisely what we're going to dive into today, and let's get started. So this approach will help you develop faster, innovative design ideation and serve as a toolkit to develop your conceptual ideas. By the end of this tutorial session, we will get accustomed to the ZBrush interface, learn to use different brushes for sculpting, working between high and low poly geometries, and bonus, we also look into array meshes. So we will create this pavilion that you see here by the end of the session. So let's dive right into it. When we first get started with ZBrush, this is the kind of screen that pops up. And most often you might have the Lightbox that gets switched on as well. Let's just close it for a moment. Basically, this is the interface that we have. We have a couple of options on the left, which are primarily the brushes that you can use during the course of your modeling. And then you can choose the type of stroke that you want to use. And you have something pretty cool called the alphas, which we might briefly take a look at. Then you can also load your own custom textures. And this is basically the default material color in ZBrush. I would prefer you to choose something in white or gray because there's a reason for it. We will see why. And yeah, just make that quick change. Then towards your right, we have the tool menu. The tool menu is basically what you would be using extensively if you're modeling on a CAD program like Rhino or Maya or 3ds Max. Then you want to bring in some 3D model from another software. This is most often a really important space to use because you might want to import a 3D OBJ file or an FBX file that you worked on in another software, because most often ZBrush does not have a proper scale. It does not have proper unit system. So what you would want to do is create a cube or a volume in another 3D software and then bring in and use it as a bounding box. So that way your process becomes super efficient. Anyways, with that being said, you also have some viewing options that we will take a look at when we get started into the modeling. Then there are so many drop-down menus. It's a rabbit hole. So we will cover some of the options, not to get overwhelmed. And all right, when you look at this blank screen, this is our canvas where we do all the modeling and everything. So I'm going to left click and then boom. Where's my 3D modeling? I cannot do anything. This is most often where most people get frustrated because ZBrush has this 2.5D interface that is for a completely different purpose, and then it does not let you go 3-dimensional. And most often than not, when you left click and drag, it basically creates so many random instances on the screen. Don't be afraid. We can get rid of all of this by hitting Control-N. Having said that, the easiest way we can get started with ZBrush is go to Lightbox. Lightbox is your space where you can find all your project files, your templates, your start points, basically. And most often than not, these are the two prime menus that you would be using. One is called the project, and then you have the other, which is called the tool. In the project tab, you basically can pick one of the primitives that you want to start sculpting upon. So mostly you have the human bust, or you have the spear and a couple of cubes. So we will use a spear to get started with the project. Then the tool menu, as we saw earlier, it's primarily for cases where you want to import from another CAD program. And also there is a variation when you're using a tool versus a project. In a project, you can also have some texture information, color information, and so much more detailed information. So if you're working extensively within ZBrush, you might want to use ZPR or the ZBrush project file type. And then if you're exporting it or importing it between different CAD programs, you will be using ZTL file type or the ZBrush tool file type. Anyways, project, I'm gonna pick the default project, which is the sphere, and I double click and then it gets started. I just hit no here, and then here we have. So right click enables me to rotate on screen. As you also notice, ZBrush interface does not have multiple windows or multiple viewports like in other CAD software. And that's also another interesting thing about it. You are most often left in an intuitive zone where you can create whatever you want and however you want. And towards your left on top, this basically is like an impression of your model. I don't know why particularly that they have, but this is something that changes when you start making some operations on your project. And towards your right is your bust that lets you rotate in different directions. But since it's a sphere, you don't necessarily notice the effect so much. You also would be noticing that I have two red dots. Those red dots indicates that there is a symmetry mode that is switched on, and that's why we see those dots moving symmetrically wherever I move. Basically, I'm only controlling the dot which is on the right and where you see two concentric circles, and the left one is just symmetrically moving in accordance with that. Okay, if I want to switch it off, I can simply hit X. ZBrush also has a lot of shortcuts that we would be using. I'm going to explain a couple of shortcuts while we model through this journey, but there are a lot more shortcuts for which the ZBrush cheat sheet is attached down below in the description. You can download that and get access to a lot more shortcuts. All right. Okay, so X, toggling on and off, can change the symmetry mode. Now, I'm also going to hit S, or you can go to the draw size here to increase the draw size. Basically, it changes my zone of influence. You can notice the difference. For example, this was my earlier draw size, let's say, and I'm going to just left click and drag. You notice that there's a specific effect, and this standard means the standard brush. This is the super default brush in ZBrush, and it creates an effect. I'm going to hit Control Z, and you can see towards my bottom left corner where you can see all the keystrokes of what I'm pressing. Hope that will be helpful. All right, I'm going to change the zone of influence by S, hitting S and then changing the draw size. So now when you see, my sculpting is super huge and it has a lot more influence on the object. Don't worry about how I rotated it. I'm going to show it shortly right now. Okay, before that, I'm just going to start with a specific brush called the Move brush. How do you get to Move brush? You go to the brush menu here, and then where's Move? I'm going to have a hard time finding it. Yeah, I did. I find it finally. So when I hit Move, and I got the Move brush. And I'm going to left click and drag. That's not what exactly I want. So I'm going to change the draw size a little bit and then drag it. Okay, now we have this oval shaped object. All right, now right click is to rotate. I think now you can see the result of rotation much more clearly because it's not a sphere shape. And then when you hold shift, it's going to pan and stop in a specific frame. So basically, while holding shift and right click, when I rotate, I basically get this sort of a left view, right view, front view, or top view. You can notice it by the bus that is getting rotated. Pretty interesting, and yeah, it's straightforward. But it's going to take a little while to get used to, because since you have only one viewport and you have to do all the operations within that viewport. Right. Okay. I got this object and I'm just right clicking and shifting, pressing shift. Now, to zoom in and zoom out, you can do it in two ways. Control, right click. So when you hold control, right click, you can zoom in and zoom out. I'm holding control, right click as we speak. And you can also do it in another way by holding alt, right click, and leaving alt. But this could be a little bit complicated. We'll use the control right click for the session. All right. Now, having said that, now we are on Move Brush. We went to the options and we chose the brush. Let's say I want to get back to the standard brush. Since we will be using a lot of series of brushes along the way, it's hard to go to the menu and search in between 1,000 brushes. So ZBrush made it easier by letting you use a couple of shortcuts. So how do we do that? Let's say I want to get back to my standard brush. I'm going to do this. I'm going to hit B. B opens up the brush menu. And then I want standard. So standard starts with S. So I hit S. And you have all the brushes that start with S. And if you notice, standard is called T. So I'm going to hit T. And then it changes to the standard brush. So BST changes to the standard brush. And similarly, BMV changes back to the move brush. And I'm going to use move for the time being because I want to do some operations on this. And I'm just doing some intuitive sculpting operations. You could do something that you see fit. There's no specific rule here that you need to exactly follow what I'm doing here on screen. And in fact, you're most welcome to explore and experiment in your own unique way. That's exactly what we want to do always at Futurely. All right, this looks a bit interesting, like a fin. And now to pan around the screen, it's Alt right click. When you hold Alt right click, you pan around the screen. So pretty straightforward. Just to recap, we have Alt right click to pan on the screen, and Control right click to zoom in and zoom out, and then Shift to change the views. Now let's say you're off track and your model is somewhere. Don't worry about it on screen. You just hit F and then you will be brought closer to the model. Your model basically comes back on screen. All right. Now, okay, so it feels like an empty space, right? That's predominantly how ZBrush was used before. But recently they introduced this feature called the floor grid, because as architects, we need a grid and a floor, like a ground. Although it's not the most helpful one, but this at least lets us have a specific grounding of where you place your architectural composition to be, whether it's a building or a pavilion, right? And then you also have this perspective distortion that's usually switched on, and that basically lets you toggle between orthographic or the perspective mode. And I like to use orthographic mode sometimes when I'm trying to work with symmetries. Let's say right now I want a symmetric operation on this object. It's so cleaner and convenient when I see it on an orthographic view rather than a perspective view. And Control Z, as usual, lets you undo the operations. And what you can also notice, interestingly, in ZBrush is they have something called a history. Basically, ZBrush records all the steps of what you're doing, and then it gets cataloged here. If you notice, they're all small rectangles. And I'm just going to go back to history step 1, and I'll show you when I left click and drag on it, it shows you the entire process of how I created it. Pretty cool, right? It's going to look really interesting when you actually do a lot more series of steps, and when you try to play the slider, that's not my favorite move. Yeah, I'm gonna put it back here. All right, let's move on with the next step and save the file before we do any more changes. So File, Save As, and we can give it a name, and it saves in the ZPR format, and that's how it is on your folders. Perfect. So once we have that, I'm going to do something different this time. I want to create some hollow space inside this mass, right? It's more like a solid object, like a blob that's just been stretched. So how do we do that? For this, I'm going to use a new set of brushes. It's called the Control-Shift brushes. And these are special brushes that get unlocked only when you hold Control-Shift. And you have something called the Clip, Slice, and Trim brushes. Trim, basically, as it tells you, it's going to trim a part of your geometry. Let's use Slice brush. That's something that we will explore for this exercise. So I have Slice Curve. So Control-Shift and Slice Curve. All right. I'm going to hold Control-Shift. Please be aware that these things only work when you have Control-Shift turned on, and then you need to left-click and drag. So you don't see any noticeable result. But what happens is it creates something called a polygroup. A polygroup basically is a form of grouping system in ZBrush that lets you divide a singular object into multiple sections or groups or geometries. So basically it is like creating or splitting this object into two parts, but you're still having it in the same form. So how do you see where the polygroup is created? You can simply do that by hitting Shift F. So when I do Shift F, you notice that there is this red polygroup and then there's this yellow polygroup. I'm going to turn off our symmetry for the time being. Okay. So this is the slice that we created, and it basically slices through the mesh and it creates the seam. Let's now try to create another seam. So I'm going to hold Control-Shift again and drag it. I'm going to do it again just for some level of accuracy. Okay. It's not a noticeable difference because of the color. I'm Control-Zing and doing this again. Okay. Right. Now we notice that there are 3 polygroups in this model. So how does that help really? This is where you can basically isolate and create specific operations on specific parts of the model. That's how awesome Polygroup will make it. So Control-Shift, and when I left click on top of this part, you notice that it gets isolated. That is pretty cool, right? Okay, I don't notice some parts of the model. How do I get it back? So for this, towards my right, I go down to something called Display Properties. Usually in meshes, since we are primarily working with meshes, we have something called the front face and the back face, and most often the back faces are turned off, and that's why it is invisible, the back side of the object. When you hit double, both your sides are visible now. It's super neat and it looks great. Okay, but still, please remember that the other parts are just hidden and it's still a part of the model. So when I Control-Shift and left click somewhere on the screen, you notice that it comes back. So basically it still operates as one solid entity, but then there is a slice in between. So Control-Shift left click, and now what I'm going to do is we go to this part called Subtool. Subtool is basically like your layering system in ZBrush, like in Photoshop, like in Rhino or any other CAD program. You have different layers, right? So in ZBrush, it's called the Subtool. And then we have the polysphere here. That's the only layer that we have, which was the sphere that we started off with when we clicked in the Lightbox. Now, you can of course name this layer as something. You can rename this layer as Part A and then hit enter. So that becomes Part A. But then I want to get rid of these 2 little fins on the side. So how do I do that? I'm going to hit Control-Shift left click So basically they are hidden. And I'm going to go down a little bit, and then there is an option called split inside the subtool menu, and that is the guy that lets you do that. So inside the split menu, you have split hidden. So split hidden basically means whatever is hidden in your current subtool, it gets split into another subtool. So I'm going to click it and see what happens. So when I click it, the fins that were there on the side now are a different subtool altogether. That's exactly what happens. And you know, this I button lets you toggle that on and off. But by default, even if you have the eyes turned off, when you click on a subtool, it'll always show what's inside that subtool, right? So I is only when you're not on top of a specific subtool. And what's also the best part is when these things are split, whatever operations you do, it does not affect the other layer. It's simply how it works in Photoshop, let's say. Great. So having said that, now I'm going to hide this guy, the part A1. I'm going to call it as fins because we are not using it for the exercise for the time being. And I'm going back to this part A. And since I've trimmed or sliced these edges, basically it's a thin frame. It doesn't have any thickness. And meshes don't really perform well when they are hollow and don't have any thickness because they don't really give you a precise result. And as architectural elements, we have thicknesses with any item that we work with. And even for sculpting, it's good to work with a thickness. All right. Now, how do you create a thickness? We have another guy inside Subtool called the extract button. And in extract, you can choose the level of smoothness. We'll go with the default values for the time being. Then there's something called the thickness. You can, of course, increase, decrease the slider. And I'm going to hit extract. You see a thick seam is created around it, which is pretty cool. And then there's also this overlapping surface that we notice. But please don't worry about it. Without changing the view, you need to hit the accept button. That's when this thing is created. And then now if you notice, this is the new extracted layer, right? I'm going to call it geometry. So both these part A and fins, we are not going to use for the time being, and we'll use the geometry. The geometry is the one with the thickness. Cool. Now, I know that it doesn't feel intuitive with the layering so much, but don't worry about it. You can just simply drag drop the layers the way you want it. And all these other sub options are something that you would use when you're doing Boolean operations and so on. But for now, this is good for us to work with. On top of this model, I'm also going to show you some other brushes that we could use. Let's say BST, that's our standard. BSG is a spiral brush. I'm going to increase the draw size a little bit and left click. That is pretty cool, right? But I want to reduce the intensity a little bit. I don't want so much of the spiral effect. And every time you do an operation and you see these jagged edges that come in, you can simply fix them by smoothing the edge. No matter whatever brush you use, if you hold shift, it changes to the smooth brush and it just eases the effect a little bit so that you don't necessarily notice a considerable difference. Basically, any brush that you use, if you left click, there's a one directional effect. And then when you do alt left click, there's a reversal effect. So that works with any sort of geometry and in any manner. Okay. This is something I've just intuitively created. You're free to experiment and create your own kind of geometry. All right. Now that we have this, I'm also going to just apply some move operations. This again is something that is totally up to you, the way you want to create it. may seem like it basically is one entity, one part of what I'm planning to do. And now the next step that I wanted to show you guys is something super interesting called the array mesh within ZBrush. So this is right below the tool, the subtool menu. There's something called the array mesh, and within that you need to click on array mesh to turn it on. But nothing happens on screen, but as the name says it, it is used for arraying operations. So what I'm going to do is, let's dig a little deeper into the sliders that we see here. We have something called the repeat slider. Repeat is basically the number of instances that we want. I'm going to dial it up to 10. Please make it not more than 10 or 20, because every time you do it, you are actually creating 25,000 new polygons or 14,000 new polygons, and then it's going to multiply. And when it's an instance, it's fine, but when you make it a mesh, depending on your computer capacity, it can crash at times. ZBrush is really known for crashing all the time. Okay, now I have changed the repeat value, and these are the primary operations that we can do in terms of offset, scale, rotate, and pivot. We haven't gone on to these options yet, but we will look into it as well. So now for the offset, when I do it, you notice that it's a pretty straightforward way of offsetting. Pretty cool, right? And you can also change the Y amount the way you want it. Super easy and super straightforward. Then you can change the scale. So by clicking on the scale, I can change the scale in X, Y, and Z directions. If I also want to change the rotate value, I can go to the rotate menu and do these operations. Oh, it's already starting to get really interesting. And I'm going to just change my matte cap to skin shade. It's just a personal preference. All right. So offset, scale, and rotate lets you do a lot of the interesting operations already. And now, if we like this, we can basically choose to bake it by clicking on Make Mesh. So far, whatever you see here, when I hit Shift F, you notice that only this is the actual geometry. So all these white guys are instances, and that's why they do not appear as polyframes when I hit Shift F, or polygroups. So I'm going to hit Make Mesh. And now if I hit Shift F, you notice that I can see all of them as a proper mesh geometry. And then my file size has also increased. Earlier it was 14,000 and now it's 150,000 active points. Great. Now that we have this, let's see how you can do further manipulation to this and how we can use some of the tools in the Gizmo. So far, we learned how to basically pan, move, scale, and rotate using these sliders. But some of these operations, you can also do it with Gizmo here. So to activate the Gizmo, you need to hit W, E, or R, move, scale, and rotate. So I'm going to hit W. This is the Gizmo that pops up. Basically, this is similar to your other 3D modeling software Gizmos. And you can use the center yellow to scale the object, then this to scale in one direction, and this to scale in the green direction, and so on. Now, we can do some manipulations with the brushes as we saw. So basically, to get back to your draw mode with the brushes, it's called draw or Q, a shortcut. And then when you go to the W, E, or R, you go into the Gizmo transpose mode, basically. Right. Now, I want to do further manipulations to the object. I don't want to confine with the basic operations that I've done with the brushes. In order to do that, I can hit on this wheel icon here, and then I'm going to choose something called Deformer Soft. Basically, this is another menu with a lot more series of options. We will specifically explore this one. This is similar to your freeform deformation in 3ds Max or Cage Deformer in other software. I'm going to add a couple of subdivisions. You can do so by choosing the yellow funnel here. Left clicking on the yellow funnel and dragging will let you add more subdivisions, but too many will make it harder to control. So I'm just gonna add one. And now I'm just dragging one of these guys. This is again an intuitive operation, so I can't wait to see what you would come up with. And this is making it a lot more richer than what we had earlier. And once you're done with that, you can hit on the gear wheel icon again and go back to Gizmo. Okay. So now that we have this, let's try out a quick hack in ZBrush. So I'm going to this geometry menu here, and then I'm going to this tab called Modify Topology, and I'm going to hit Mirror and Weld. I'm going to choose Y and hit Mirror and Weld. I'm going to hit OK. And as you notice, this is the kind of result that got produced. What I'm going to do is Control Z again, and I'm going to try to place it onto the ground. And now I hit Mirror and Weld. What happens here is it basically takes the ground planes and then it tries to mirror your object across the ground plane. And what's also beautiful is when it gets mirrored, it seamlessly seals and welds the geometry, so you don't notice any overlap whatsoever. So it's a beautiful kind of merge, and then it creates this beautiful symmetric composition. All right, what I did here now is through Shift R, you can see an amazing render preview at any different point by pressing Shift R. And this is how the preview is. I'm going to go to the Gizmo again and try to get a little bit more control or a little bit more sophistication. Once done with that, go back to Gizmo 3D. And you can also rotate this object the way you want. While rotating, you can hold Shift to snap at 5-degree instances. All right. Now with that, I'm gonna do an X mirror and weld. It's not exactly what I want. I'm gonna do a Z mirror and weld. So as you see, it's basically something that I try to get it with a trial and error, and this is some sort of an intuitive thing that you would always do in ZBrush, because since you don't have the ability to control with a particular mirror plane, I'm just working out various iterations and see how the mirror planes would work and create symmetries. And I have to say that I really enjoy this result. I'm doing some trial and errors to find a right position that is quite interesting. Let's take this one for instance, and you also notice that the gizmo is constantly rotating based on the number of operations that you do. But if you want to, let's say, get back to a specific window and specific orientation, you don't want this kind of complex looking direction for the gizmo. You can simply hold Alt and reset orientation, so that way you get back the original orientation of the gizmo. Right. Now I'm going to do a mirror and weld in Y direction. Wow. This is kind of the direction that I was looking forward to for showing you guys in this exercise. And here we have it. Perfect. Now with that, let's do this one last mirror operation in the X direction. And there we go. Okay. Now that we have this, I'm going to again try to use the Deformer Soft and make it a little bit more organic instead of this sort of highly controlled result. So that way we also bring in our own personal creative touch into the process. And that's precisely where ZBrush shines the most, because whatever you create, whether it's through these kind of array meshes or sculpts, you most often create a very unique result that is so personalized and specific to you. You don't necessarily create something that someone else can easily replicate. And that's where you have this sort of a designer freedom that is prevalent only here, and it lacks in many other design software. I'm also trying to place it a little bit on the ground here, so that way it sits like an architectural project. And I'm going to choose the gear wheel and go back to my Gizmo 3D. Great. Now, Shift R shows us the render preview, or it's also called as the best preview render here. And this is the result, guys. This is the result that we were talking about. We can take it to Keyshot, and there's a live link between ZBrush and Keyshot, using which you can set up your bridge and click this button. It's going to do the render for you. For more Keyshot tutorials, you can check out the extensive Keyshot tutorial of Futurely. You have a task at hand right now. So here's your assignment watching this video. We would love it if you can share a composition using the techniques followed in this exercise and create your own array meshed architectural composition. And we'd love to see how it works out. And bonus part here, before we conclude this session, you can also go to Lightbox. I'm going to hit Shift R before that. I'm going to change to draw mode, Shift R, Lightbox, and you have something called the filters. This is pretty cool. To get an instant render preview of your composition, you can choose whatever kind of style that you see fit, and here you go. You get an instant preview in that specific style. You can get a comic shader, or you can get a toon or line art or line drawing kind of an aesthetic. So it's really quick and efficient for you to create conceptual models that you want. And then to export this image, you can simply go to the document window here and export. So you can choose a name. I'm going to hit 2 here. And basically you can change the resolution, but since this document resolution is set to this, you can hit OK, and that's it. It gets saved. So this way you can also take many specific angles and see how your project, the model works, and what kind of spaces emerge, what kind of architectural qualities emerge. And then you start getting into the detailed phases of design. So this way you can, within less than 30 minutes, you can actually create a sketch and conceptualize the kind of direction you want to take your project in. With that being said, we really can't wait to see what you could come up with. Feel free to export your screen grabs and share it with us on IG stories or join our Discord server. There's a lot of activity there and you can share it there as well. And if you have any questions, feel free to share it in the comments down below in this video. If you really enjoyed the session and want to dive deeper into this topic, you can check out our full courses in the description. And also feel free to like, share, and subscribe and ring the bell to not miss any more exciting sessions in the future. This is Vamsi from Futurely signing off. See you guys. Have a good one.